where Dr. Ankur Kakkar will hold a dialogue with Professor Sreejit Datta on the history of education and education policy with a focus on humanities education. I request the panelists to please come to the stage. Thank you.
Namaskar. Thank you so much, Dr. Kakkar, for this eminently edifying lecture presentation. You did not only take us through a journey through time, showing us the various educational practices and rooted traditions that we had in the field of education, dissemination of knowledge, production of it in our country in an ancient era. But I would say you have also journeyed us through different civilizational outlooks on knowledge. So that was very, very useful. And probably to take this forward, and because you are a historian yourself, I would take the liberty of starting our conversation on education, history of education and education policy at the current point, rather than talking about the past. And I think it's not too unfair to do that, because our studies of the past, and you will be able to tell us better about it, the studies of the past have a very important bearing on our present, showing that the past and the present and the future are not really very different from each other, but they are in a flux, in a continuity. So I would like to start this discussion by asking you about the state of humanities education, social sciences also to a bit, that we are currently, not just in India, but because you also had your training, your master's as well as doctoral training in Europe. So if you would like to talk about the state of humanities education in India, but also at large in the world, where are we standing currently?
Thank you, Sreejit, for this wonderful question, and thanks for your warm words of appreciation for my lecture. So, when it comes to the situation of humanities at present in India, let me highlight some challenges and some basic problems that we are facing in this field of social sciences in general. If you compare it with natural sciences, for example, so what happens is in natural sciences is that you have a field of research and experimentation and scientific inquiry, and then you have some universal laws, and then you conduct those experiments and you perform those results and you get the outcomes. And also in natural sciences, those outcomes have a direct bearing on the social aspects also, in the sense that, for example, if a scientist is doing research on finding a cure for Zika virus, then they will conduct the experiment and they will undertake their research and they'll come up with their conclusion that will be beneficial for society or harmful, or whatever impact it will have on society. It will have a direct impact on the society. In many cases, now we have found cures for cancer, for example. We have developed a vaccine for COVID-19, which is a result of scientific research. The problem with humanities research at the moment is that we are not able to come up with solutions for ground reality problems, unlike the sciences. In the sciences, we are able to develop vaccines, we are able to find cures for different viruses, for example. We are making great advances in biotechnology, in nanotechnology, and in semiconductors research, which is directly impacting the way we live. It is impacting our lifestyles. The use of all these technical things is a result of that scientific research. But humanities research at this time, in the current situation, is not having that impact. So, for example, the problems that humanities research is entrusted with let's say it is entrusted with the problem of solving ethnic conflict, religious conflict, the sort of problem of population control, the problem of environmental issues. We do not see any solution that is offered by any humanities person that is directly impacting these areas and helping us. The reason for that is, which I believe is one of the fundamental reasons, that humanities research is not so much grounded in terms of with the ground reality, and also it is not so much grounded in the latest findings from science. So because it has isolated itself from the scientific findings and also from the ground reality, they are not able to propose any solution for the current problems. So the future of sciences, of social sciences, is bright only if they choose to align, or rather root themselves in the natural sciences also, and with the ground reality in general. And this is also with science. They also have to cover, I mean, they are doing this. They are also covering many aspects that were earlier related only to social science. So for example, if you want to, let's say, if we have to develop a policy for environment, if our lawmakers have to come up with a new environmental policy, do you think they will only consult the humanities persons? They'll also consult scientists, because this issue of environment policy is an issue of ethics also. It is also an issue related to biology. It is also an issue in which we'll have to take the social sciences into consideration. So, as things stand today, the humanities disciplines and the departments of humanities in most of the colleges are not aware of this interdisciplinary approach to problems. They are not aware that most of the issues that confront us today are multidimensional in nature. And any isolated single approach will not solve any purpose. Another problem with humanities departments right now is that they use so much jargon, and they use the phraseology is so restricted only to their discipline that people outside their discipline cannot understand that. Whether it is because of some loyalty to a certain faction, or maybe ideologically driven, could also be the reason. But the fact is that unless there is a dialogue across a large section of society with humanities disciplines or departments, there cannot be any solution. So you can write endless amount of research papers on caste conflict or ethnic conflict, but it doesn't help matters on the ground. And if it doesn't solve matters on the ground, then the resources that are being spent for humanities research are waste. So humanities departments at the moment have many challenges. They have to ground themselves in ground reality. They have to be aligned with natural sciences, with latest findings in natural sciences. They have to do away with this limited phraseology, which is only understandable by a select clique of social scientists. So I think these are some of the problems that social sciences and humanities are currently facing, and all these things can be done away with, I mean, if we deal with that in the right manner.
So, thank you for that. In what you said, I hear two strands of ideas. One where you are leading us to show a kind of break between a possible dialogue that might have existed in some distant past between the humanities and liberal arts approach to education and science and scientific methodologies based education, mainly the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So this break between STEM subjects and humanities and social sciences on one hand, and another problem which is perhaps more inherent to the humanities and social sciences is the problem of phraseology, the problem of being too jargon-driven. These are two things. But I would like to first talk about the first problem that you have indicated. Where do you think this sort of a break or a rupture happened? At what point in time? I see that as mainly a problem in the European university-based education system. But we used to have a time in Europe where we have seen great educational institutions in ancient Greece and Rome, starting from the Lyceum of Aristotle and the gymnasium where Plato used to hold his great dialogues. There we had a more unified and Catholic approach to all streams of knowledge. From there, we also have a very glorious tradition of the medieval scholastic European, mainly based in the church-funded universities, where also we saw a very unified approach to different streams of knowledge. Where do you see this break happened, that we have come here today, not just in this country, which is bearing mostly a colonial legacy, but also at the center where this sort of approach originated? Where did this break happen?
Thank you, Sreejit. This is a very interesting question, and also it is rooted in the historical evolution of the Western disciplines. So, in the medieval time, one of the problems with the church-funded universities was that, and also because it was theologically a problem, was that they had to justify the sustenance of both faith-based studies and logic-based studies. And Saint Thomas Aquinas, for example, had this. He made this segregation between the world of reason and the world of philosophy. And theologically, Saint Thomas Aquinas and many others had to reconcile belief and reason, because belief was something that was theologically given to them and that could not be questioned, and reason was something that they could question and they could inquire. So with that starting point, I would say that there was a division in the Western mind. Then the division in the terms of in the departments and disciplines later on, this came after the Enlightenment. So in the Enlightenment, reason was given importance over faith. And most of the Enlightenment or post-Enlightenment thinkers made this division between this mind and matter and this realm of the rational self and the realm of the speculative and the realm of the philosophical self. And anything which was worthy of inquiry or worthy of being called discipline had to adhere to a rational framework. So the parameters that were set were according to the objective scientific inquiry parameters. So any subject worth studying would be considered respectable if it adhered to these parameters after the Enlightenment. So after Francis Bacon used his objective inquiry method, and then we have other scientists doing the same. This led to a separation between what is true science and objective science. Anything which is empirically verifiable, anything you can test verifiably, empirically, that is true and that is science, and other things are all speculative. This had, because of this, there was separation between disciplines, and in fact, even in the social sciences disciplines, this endeavor to prove themselves to be scientific also started from that time. So all social sciences, from sociology to history and to economics, they started developing methods to prove that they were scientific, in the sense that they could use empirically verifiable data and all. This was, I think, the root of the problem in the West. But recent research and recent findings have shown that you cannot separate the disciplines. What happened is, earlier, because of this separation, there were certain areas that only scientists could pursue and certain areas that only the philosophers could pursue. For example, if you wanted to study ethics or behavior, then that was the domain of the philosophers and of the, let's say, social scientists. But if you wanted to study matter, and if you wanted to study nature, and you wanted to study the universe and all that, or the human body, that would be the domain of the scientists. But recent research has shown that this division is no longer valid, because recently many works of scientists have been published that talk about those aspects which were not considered scientific earlier. So, for example, you have works of neuroscientists on ethics, on behavior, on social issues. So now this division, at least in the West, is slowly getting blurred, and people are beginning to realize that any subject has different dimensions, and you cannot approach any subject, if you want to go into the depth, without a knowledge of both science and a grounding also in the humanities and social sciences.
Thanks for that. And from what you said, it brings to my mind the case of the field of consciousness studies, I think, which is a very prominent example in the kind of interdisciplinary approach to knowledge production, as well as training people, young scientists as well as young philosophers, because this particular field, consciousness studies, stands at the intersection of different fields, as you mentioned, neurosciences. Then I think there are quite a few good philosophers who are working. David Chalmers' name comes to my mind. Then there are physicists who are all converging on this particular approach to reading the human mind and redefining the very concept of consciousness. So I see what you're trying to point here, and I think it's very clear that this movement towards an unification of approaches has already started, maybe in pockets in Europe or the West at large. But coming back to our discussion with respect to where we stand in India, so far as humanities and social sciences, or let's say generally a liberal arts-based education is concerned, where are we in this whole picture? Can you give us some ideas on that?
You mean humanities in India?
That's right.
Okay. So, if you look at most of the humanities departments in India, they are still mostly designed along the conventional lines that were formulated in the modern time, after the British came and then designed the university system. So you still have humanities departments in India that are traditional and, in this sense, conventional departments, like a department of history or department of sociology, department of economics. And there still exist silos, and these departments function in silos. In the fact that you will hardly see a person from a geography department working in a history department, and you will rarely see students who are studying in both departments. It is in fact discouraged. If you are a geography student, you can't take a course in history, which I find to be quite ridiculous, because you cannot study history without geography, and you can't study geography without history. So we still in India don't have this at least in the mainstream academic framework, I'm saying, we still are yet to implement this idea that any study is a study ranging across disciplines, whether it is a historical inquiry or it is an inquiry of into the anthropology of a certain people. Any study will be a study ranging across disciplines. And this was very famously also said by J.R. Diamond in his book Guns, Germs and Steel, in which he studies the origins of societies. And he says that history is not a field isolated in itself. It is to be studied in collaboration with various disciplines. It is biology and genetics, and you have anthropology. So the problem in India is that we are still stuck to this conventional idea that disciplines are separate and segregated, and that's why we still have separate departments where students from one department cannot take up a course in any other department. And whereas the interesting part is that they are asked to do interdisciplinary study. When they are asked to take up projects or they are asked to write their thesis, then
Typically towards the end of their curriculum, right?
so they are trained in a discipline, but they are expected to write reports on interdisciplinary
So a
approach.
mismatch between training and expectations.
Yes.
That's interesting. And I also think what is quite interesting in how you identified the area where all these disciplines and approaches are operating currently in silos, you called it the mainstream education. And maybe I would request you to define what you mean by mainstream. But my guess is that you are largely talking about the public institutions in India, because in India, when we talk about good universities, the few names that come to our mind immediately are basically the universities like the JNU or the Delhi University, Jamia Millia, or the institutions like IITs, where cutting edge research is currently being worked upon, both in technology sciences as well as in the humanities. There are some very good departments that we know of. So by mainstream, do you mainly indicate towards the public funded, the government funded institutions in India? Because maybe I would like to draw your attention to the role that the private universities are currently playing. For example, there are universities in the vicinity of the Delhi NCR region which have started offering courses in liberal arts where there is some sort of a unification of approach emerging. For example, in our university, in Rishihood, we are going to offer from the next academic year an MA program, a master's program in Interdisciplinary Humanities and Research, what we are calling it. So I would need you to define that mainstream and whether that nature of the mainstream is perhaps changing in India. I would like your comments in that.
Thank you. Yes, you correctly guessed. By mainstream, I mean most of the public institutions and that are recognized by the government and also mostly funded by government that have adhered to the UGC framework. Yes, I agree, and I am glad to know, and I am aware that there are many private institutions that have now started launching programs that are interdisciplinary. Now, the problem with launching some of these departments in various universities, especially I'll talk about the public institutions first. So UGC recently recommended that there should be a humanities department in every technical institution, whether it is IIT or any other institution. The problem with that was that when it got implemented, the humanities departments in these institutions became silos in themselves, and the scientific or the technological departments were functioning as they were originally. So we did not really see a collaboration, rather we saw a different department being set up within an institution. That was not the objective of interdisciplinary study. The objective of interdisciplinary study was to conduct a study which involves experts and involves expertise of different disciplines within that study. For example, if you want to, let's say, conduct a research into let's say you want to study the way that the family system in India has been changing. Suppose you want to study that. Now, typically you will have some social scientist who will get some data and get some trends and all that. But because of the multidimensional nature of the subject, it is important to have people from the field of biology and genetics to also study this. So the point I am trying to say is that when we talk about multidisciplinary study, we are not talking about that there should be separate departments within a university who are doing their own work. The work should be done collectively by the departments. That is something which is still missing, at least in the government mainstream institutions. And yes, some private institutions, as you said, have launched programs that are interdisciplinary in nature. What I envision, and especially looking at the education policy, the latest one, is that there will be more such programs that will have subjects ranging from across disciplines. So you'll have a bachelor's degree in, let's say, leadership, as you were saying, but the subjects will be taken up, from both sciences and humanities. So maybe you'll have a course in history, you'll have a course in classics, you will have a course in mathematics also, you will have a course in physics also. Okay, so this we will see happening more and more in the future. And we will also see, and at least I hope that we see, students from a particular discipline having that freedom to take up any course of their choice in any discipline. So let's say if a student studying engineering in IIT wants to take up one course in history from a department, whether it is in his institution or anywhere, that student should be free to be able to join that class. In the current education system, you can't do that. You will not be allowed to do that. So unless you give that freedom of range of learning, you can't expect to have the greatest innovators, because the innovation comes when you have that freedom of learning.
And while you are referring to a possible lack of great innovators, unless we adopt the kind of approach that you just elaborated on, it comes to my mind also that through your presentation, we saw the example of a great social scientist in the form of Sri Dharampalji, who had to go through an immense amount of data that was colonially extracted and archived. One has to also have the skill of going through and making sense of the vast amounts of data. So that skill is not something that would typically be given to a historiographer. So I think you would like to talk about that, maybe because of your close proximity to Sri Dharampalji's work. Maybe you can show us the kind of training that, and also the kind of intellectual and emotional traits that are expected in a student of 21st century who's looking up to creating knowledge, creating wonderful research, doing works on history, philosophy, basic sciences at the same time. So what kind of traits, psychological traits, intellectual traits, emotional traits would be expected in a 21st century student of such a discipline, from your example of Sri Dharampalji's work?
Yeah, thank you. I think Dharampalji was a very interesting example of interdisciplinary study. So first of all, he was not a trained historian. He did not have any degree in history. Yes, and he all these books that he wrote were because of his dedication towards conducting scientific inquiry. So he developed these techniques over time, and yes, you're absolutely right. One requires a huge amount of statistical skills to be able to analyze so much of data in the form of tables and reports, and also compile the tables and reports, which have such a vast number of figures, ranging from different kinds of figures. Okay, so Dharampalji is a very good example of someone who has a mixed skill set. They have so he was also a statistician. If in one sense one could look at him as a statistician, considering the amount of data and reports and tables that he compiled just of statistics. So the number of castes in a particular school, the number of the number of sociological background of the students and all that. That is the work of a statistician. And one could look at him as a historian, considering the amount of historical insights that he had when he looked at these documents. So taking Dharampalji's case, for example, one could say that when we are talking about the traits that a student should have, they should have that openness of thought, that their ideas and their theories are open to are subject to the kind of data they are getting. The problem with a lot of social scientists, and especially young researchers, is that they often have already decided what they are going to write about before they actually get the data. So that shows...
So the conclusions are fixed in advance. So
yes. So Dharampalji did not have that. He was open to new data and new ideas, and that is why he was able to do what he did. Also, he had that perspicacity. He was so perceptive also, that he was able to see through the writings of these surveys. So one doesn't have to take everything on face value, and one doesn't have to one should have that ability to be able to read against the grain, as you say. And also the fact that one has to understand the background of the person who is authoring that document, because then you can understand that from which standpoint it has been written, and you can understand the motivations of that historical document. So this requires a training also in psychology in some sense, because how a colonial official would be thinking, or how a British administrator would be thinking, how a Christian missionary would be thinking, how a government official would be thinking, because that will impact their documents. So Dharampalji, when he used to produce these documents and used to give out information from them, he would be very, very selective, and he would be very careful in understanding and analyzing them. Okay, so what to make of these documents, how to interpret these documents, is also an art, and that is also an art of a social scientist. So it requires a wide range of skills. You need to have that that hunger for data, for that as a statistician. You need to have that patience of a historian. You need to have the understanding of a psychologist. So you need to wear many hats.
Right, and because we are approaching the end of our conversation, as a summary, a particular quote by the contemporary British philosopher Gillian Rose comes to my mind, where she's talking about three aspects that typically a student or a scholar of philosophy would have, but I would like to maybe extend that to all of humanities and social sciences disciplines. And here Rose is talking about intellectual eros and sort of endless curiosity to know about things. Secondly, she's talking about attention. the ability to be wrapped by the object that is in front of you without yourself seizing it. And finally, the third thing that she points out as a sort of very essential trait of an ideal student of the humanities is acceptance of aporia or pathlessness. This acceptance that there may be no definite solutions to questions, but only the clarification of the statements in the way we pose that problem, in the way we state those problems. So, to conclude this, I would like to have your remarks on whether it is possible to sort of assimilate the classical Indian approach and, on the other hand, the classical European or the Hellenic approach to knowledge, especially from the point of view of pedagogy, because you have studied education systems from different parts of the world. And you also talked in your presentation about the Chaussat Kalas, the 64 different kinds of arts that one needs to master in order to become, rigorous as an expert. And another thing that you have pointed out, which I think is very important in your presentation, is the ability that the ancient Indian gurus and students had to engage in open dialogues. So this openness to knowledge, wherever knowledge and good ideas may come from, let all the doors and windows be open. This is in fact what the Vedas say. So do you think that sort of a dialogue between the Indic and the Hellenic classical approaches to education is possible? Do you think we can reach an assimilation of these two?
So I think that yes, there is definitely a dialogue possible, and in fact the classical Hellenistic thought has many similarities with the classical Indian thought. The one point of convergence which I think is regarding the nature of studying the self. And this is also something that this is a very important takeaway from the classical systems of learning for both Indian and ancient classical systems, is that the observer was never separated from the observed. And this is a problem that the current humanities and social sciences disciplines are facing. The fact that they talk about the deconstruction of reality, of social reality, without talking about the deconstruction of themselves.
I think you talked about the Adhara Shuddhi in this regard, the purification or edification, cultivation, let me say, of the container of knowledge, the subject.
Yes. So in Indian knowledge systems, the approach was the reverse. We first began by deconstructing the self. Then we started talking about the social reality. The problem with the current humanities and social science approach is that there is all this talk about deconstruction of the social reality without talking about the deconstruction of the self. And this is a problem with this current postmodernist approach. In the classical systems, whether it was classical Indian thought or it was the classical ancient Greek thought, this was a fundamental feature that the observed was not separated from the observer. So if you had a certain approach in looking at things, it would be included in that study. As they say, the skin in the game. Okay, so skin in the game was recognized in the ancient Indian and ancient classical Greek thought also. Okay, so this feature of not recognizing the skin in the game is only in the current postmodernist approach. That's why they are not able to come up with any real solution. So this, I think, is a very important takeaway, that knowing the self and knowing the perceiver, and not separating the perceiver from the perceived, not separating the subject from the object, is something we should learn from the ancient Indian and ancient Greek thought also. Thank you.
So, with that hope of achieving a near future assimilation of the best of the two worlds, I think you have reinstated our faith in some ways by your inputs. And I would like to thank you for that, and especially for coming to our campus and sharing ideas, exchanging ideas with us. I think this is a delight to speak to you, somebody like you who has had training in the humanities, but also, interestingly, I found out that you had your basic training in the undergraduate days as an engineer. So maybe with a few personal remarks, on your own journey of traveling from one discipline to another, quite a few different worlds that you have traversed intellectually, we can come to the conclusion of this talk.
Thank you. Yes, even my journey has been quite interdisciplinary in many ways. The reason I took up engineering was, at that time I was very interested in science and fascinated by logic. I'm still fascinated by logic. But I realized that my inner quest is to look at the larger historical and intellectual patterns of social and cultural evolution. So that's why I took up humanities later on, and I didn't want to focus specifically on any technical aspect of a subject. So I took up humanities, but I retained my logical rigor in any study I was doing. So I always used my logical and scientific methods, and I never let go of that. At the same time, I also looked at the whole and larger cultural aspects of things, and I realized that in social science it is very difficult to simplify things, because social science is the study of society and life in general. So it is difficult to come up, it is impossible to come up with any universal laws like you can do in science. So in fact, the questions that social sciences poses are really the hard questions, such as the deep origin of societies. And this is something which I learned along the way, that you can come up with universal laws in science, but because it is easy to, it is comparatively easier to give a structure to that phenomena of nature. But you can't do that in social science. The functioning of societies is highly complex. So I'm glad and I am privileged that I had the opportunity to undertake a training in both science and humanities, because the scientific training helped me in understanding logic and the use of scientific methods, which I also am currently using in my research. And training in humanities helped me understand the complexity of life and the complexity of social systems. Thank you.
So let us hope that the national education policy and the various public funded as well as private initiatives will help emerge more and more Dr. Kakkars who will not possibly face many challenges, as I'm sure you had to, in order to juggle between two worlds. I myself have had to do a bit of that. So let us hope that the unified approach to knowledge especially through liberal arts disciplines and liberal arts education, we will have more and more innovators, ideators, and thought as well as public leaders. With that hope, I would like to conclude our conversation. Once again, thanking Dr. Kakkar for this wonderful conversation and also his very enlightening lecture presentation. I would also like to thank everybody who has been working very hard on the back end, the entire Marcom team at Rishihood University, all the technicians, the people who are managing the auditorium, the camera person, Manjeet ji, there are Ohona, Orgho, Anju ji, everybody else in the Marcom team, also the admin at the Rishihood University, and everybody at Rashtram School of Public Leadership, Rishihood University, for making this Center for Civilisational Studies effort possible and possibly a success. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sreejit.